Keep yapping, courtroom clown. That's what he spat, leaning back in his leather chair, smug as a man who'd bought silence for decades. But 93 seconds later, Jasmine Crockett cracked open a blood-sealed envelope that detonated across 41 million screens. Inside, a $5 million payout tied to the gender of a child, a trust fund created 7 weeks before the boy was born, and a contract that read like it belonged in a boardroom, not a bedroom. This wasn't just testimony. It was an autopsy of power, and every clause was dripping with control. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the chamber doors opened, and Washington held its breath like a prayer had just slipped into the room uninvited. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Reporters paused their scribbles. Aides forgot to blink. Even the overhead lights flickered as if they too weren't sure what was about to unfold. There was no shouting, no chants from outside, no gavel pounding the desk. Just stillness, cold, perfect stillness. The kind that only arrives before something irreversible. And then came the heels. 3 deliberate clicks, each one landing like the toll of a funeral bell. Jasmine Crockett entered not like a congresswoman, but like the final witness in a criminal trial no one wanted televised. She didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't so much as glance at the press gallery. Her eyes locked on one point and one point only, the seat across the chamber. The one occupied by Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. His tie hung too long, his eyes half-lidded with contempt, as if this was all beneath him, as if this would be another soundbite he'd wave away by morning. But even he didn't expect what was in her hand. A single envelope, aged, edges soft with time, sealed in crimson wax that hadn't cracked despite the years, like it had been waiting for this day. Like it knew. She didn't bring binders, no flashy exhibits, not a single page of notes. Just that envelope, and a fire that pulsed from beneath her navy suit like it had lived there too long. She took her seat slowly, the room somehow tightening around her. Even the American flags behind the dais seemed to stand a little stiffer, unsure which way to blow. And then she looked up, calm, precise, controlled. She adjusted the microphone by exactly 1 inch. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice a scalpel cloaked in velvet, "you propose slashing $4.2 billion in healthcare funding for low-income mothers. Can you confirm whether that figure came from the Congressional Budget Office, or just your gut feelings from the club at Mar-a-Lago?" A few stifled chuckles leaked from the gallery. Trump grinned, but it was brittle, too tight at the edges. "You sound angry, Miss Crockett. Don't get emotional, sweetheart," he said, tossing the words like peanuts to a monkey at the zoo. One of his attorneys laughed under his breath. Another scribbled something into a legal pad, a diagonal line slashing through ink like a warning. Jasmine didn't blink. She tapped her pen on the table once. The sound echoed like a gunshot in a crypt. Then she leaned forward, and the air in the chamber changed, not in volume, in gravity. "Let me rephrase," she said, her hand brushing the envelope ever so slightly. "Would you consider the birth of your son a private joy or a public investment?" That was when the room stopped breathing. A Republican aide dropped their pen. One of the reporters gasped. Twitter exploded before the echo of her question had faded from the marble. Across the country, living rooms turned cold. Kitchen sinks stopped running. Screens paused mid-scroll. And on the other side of the chamber, the man once deemed untouchable sat up, jaw clenched, the color in his cheeks rising slowly like steam from a sealed kettle. "What are you insinuating?" he snapped, voice harsher now. But Jasmine wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had drifted to the main camera, C-SPAN's silent eye, Cha-Bomb eye, broadcasting live into 37 million households and counting. She tilted her head slightly, and when she spoke, the cadence in her voice was almost mournful. "This hearing is about federal budgets," she said. "But what we're about to discuss is a different kind of transaction. One that doesn't show up on ledgers, but leaves receipts just the same." She slid the envelope an inch closer to the mic. In America, every corner of it, leaned forward. This was no longer about policy. This was legacy under oath. This was blood converted into clauses. This was silence, finally trembling. Because for 2 decades, whispers had floated just beneath the surface about the timing, the money, the offshore accounts, the boy with the billion-dollar name. But no one had ever dared crack the seal. No one had ever called the contract by its real name. Until now. At exactly 93 seconds into this hearing, the narrator's voice resumed gently in the background. America stopped assuming it understood the cost of power, because Jasmine Crockett didn't come with accusations. She came with proof. And what lay inside that envelope wasn't just scandal. It was the blueprint of control, engineered, signed, and notarized. She hadn't come to ask for answers. She'd come to show that the answers had been buried all along. And today, they were about to surface. The weight of the chamber had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Like the way a room knows when someone speaks the truth, before the words even fully form. Jasmine didn't move. Her fingers rested lightly on the blood-sealed envelope, not clutching it like evidence, but steadying it like a confession. The air was tense, the kind of tension that feels like thunder hasn't yet broken, but the clouds already know it's coming. And then, without warning or buildup, she returned to the mic. "Mr. Trump," she said slowly, without flinch or fury, "you propose cutting $4.2 billion from federal health care for low-income mothers, a figure your team defends by citing economic efficiency. But what I'm wondering today is what metrics you use to measure the value of motherhood." Trump leaned back in his chair, half bored, half cautious. He gestured lazily toward one of his lawyers. "We've already explained this, Ms. Crockett," he said, with a smirk born of too many rooms where no one challenged him. "It's not personal. It's policy. Basic budgeting." She tilted her head just slightly. "That's interesting," she replied, "because I've read the numbers. And numbers don't usually come with offshore wire transfers, pre-birth trusts, or a $5 million clause tied to reproductive outcome." That one hit. Trump's shoulders squared ever so slightly, and one of his lawyers reached down to adjust his notes, though he wasn't reading them. Another leaned in, whispering into the former president's ear. But Trump waved him off, staring forward like he was daring her to swing harder. And she did. In March 2005, Jasmine continued, her tone now laced with something firmer, something colder. A transfer of exactly $2.3 million was wired from a Cayman-based account associated with the Trump Organization into a holding trust labeled Future Foundation. She let that hang. Not to build suspense, because she didn't need to. The silence in the room did it for her. "That date," she continued, "falls 7 weeks before your son was born. A son who, before he ever took his first breath, was already named in a series of legal entities designed for brand protection, asset flow, and, according to documents submitted under seal, a legacy initiative targeting a political future." Trump chuckled, but it was thin, brittle, a crack forming under pressure. "You sound emotional, sweetheart," he said, this time louder, attempting to draw laughter from his side of the aisle. A few forced smiles flickered among his allies. The moment was supposed to be diffused, lightened, dominated. But Jasmine didn't blink. Instead, she slowly pushed the envelope 1 inch closer to the edge of the table. Her eyes locked not on Trump, but on the main camera lens, where millions were watching. Then she spoke again, and this time her voice was the kind that left bruises beneath the surface. "Did your son come from joy or a financial incentive?" It was a question so simple, so piercing, it didn't need elaboration. It was surgical, the kind of question that slices clean through years of media spin, campaign branding, photo ops, and legacy speeches, and lands squarely in the realm of humanity. Trump's face twitched, his mouth opened slightly, then shut again. For the first time, he looked toward the envelope. And across the country, in kitchens and break rooms, on sidewalks and couches, Viewers leaned in, not because they were waiting for his answer, but because they already suspected she wasn't asking rhetorically. She knew something. That much was clear. And now the audience did too. A pause, a heartbeat. Then Jasmine added almost quietly, "This isn't about your politics, Mr. Trump. This is about whether the child you presented to America as legacy was ever allowed to simply be a child at all." His attorney stood, objecting, something about speculation, about decorum, but the chairwoman waved him down. Jasmine remained still. The camera zoomed in ever so slightly. You could see the sheen of sweat forming just above Trump's brow, the way his tie suddenly seemed too tight, the way he folded his arms across his chest like he was holding something in, or maybe trying to hold something back. And Jasmine? She hadn't even raised her voice, because she didn't have to. The question had already been asked, and whether he answered or not, the answer was already unraveling. Through financial records, sealed depositions, medical documents, and testimony waiting like landmines just beneath the surface of this hearing. And all Jasmine had to do now was open the next page. She reached calmly into a red leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the kind that looked harmless from a distance, white, precise, official. But on the screen behind her, the moment it appeared under the document cam, the room shifted again. Not because of the font, not even because of the account number, but because of the date, March 4th, 2005. In crisp black ink, the screen displayed transfer confirmation, 2,300,000 USD, origin, Trump Organization offshore account, Cayman Islands, destination, BT, Holdings Trust, New York, memo, Future Foundation initiation. Jasmine didn't speak, not yet. She didn't have to. The murmurs started first from the back of the room where reporters leaned forward, squinting. A few gasped softly, others tapped frantically on their phones. The committee was silent, frozen. Trump adjusted his cufflinks, but the motion was tight, mechanical. Not swagger, not bravado, just tension. Jasmine stepped slowly to the center of the room. "This transfer," she said, "was made exactly 7 weeks before the birth of your son, Baron William Trump." She paused there, not for drama, but for digestion, because the room needed to absorb that sentence like a toxin being released, drop by drop. "Now, typically," she continued, "when a trust fund is established for a newborn child, it's done after the birth, after the certificate, after the name. But in this case, the fund predated not only the birth, but the baby shower, the announcement, even the public acknowledgement that Melania was pregnant at all." She clicked the remote in her hand. The screen behind her changed. A new slide appeared. BT Holdings Trust Formation. Filing date, March 2nd, 2005. Beneficiary, male heir, Trump lineage. Unnamed. Condition, disbursement of full assets contingent upon male birth. You could feel the temperature drop in the room. One of the Republican aides audibly whispered, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. Jasmine let the words settle. Then deliberately she continued, "This wasn't a college fund. It wasn't a safety net. It was a contingency payout. An agreement triggered only if the child born was male. If not, if the child had been female, the trust would dissolve and no disbursement would occur." She took a single step closer to the table, now facing Trump directly. "In your own organization's filings, this child wasn't listed as a person. He was listed as a condition." Trump finally moved, not his mouth, but his hands, folding tighter across his chest. His jaw flexed once hard. One of his lawyers scribbled furiously, and another began whispering again, this time more urgently. But Jasmine didn't look at them. She kept her focus locked, calm, unwavering. She clicked again. The screen now displayed a scan of a confidential memo. Subject, foundation confirmation, gender clause. From Senior Counsel, Trump Org, to D. Trump. As stipulated, activation of the $2, 3M disbursement shall occur only upon live male birth. No action required for female outcome unless renegotiated. She turned to the committee. Let that sink in, she said. There was a memo, not a hope, not a nursery plan, a memo outlining what happened if Melania Trump gave birth to the wrong child. The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be, they were sharper whispered. The gallery was still. One member of the press dropped his phone. On cable news screens across the country, captions began to scroll in real time. Breaking: Crockett exposes 2.3M. Male birth clause in Trump trust fund. Jasmine walked slowly back to her chair and tapped the envelope again, gently. We have been told, she said, that this presidency was built on family, on legacy, on strength. But what happens when that legacy is negotiated in ink? What happens when fatherhood becomes a business deal? When a womb becomes a wager? The room didn't answer. It couldn't. She sat back down. Across the chamber, Donald Trump was no longer grinning, not even pretending to. His hands, now clasped tightly, trembled just enough to be caught by C-SPAN's center camera. And Jasmine? She hadn't even opened the envelope yet. She let the silence stretch, long enough for the weight of what had already been said to press down on every person in the room. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached into the red leather case beside her and retrieved a second folder. This one thicker, sealed with a gold emblem that shimmered like a threat under the fluorescence. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved with the care of someone handling something ancient, delicate, and volatile. When she flipped it open, it was like unsealing the vault of a hidden dynasty. Without raising her voice, she spoke into the microphone, her tone firm and eerily measured. This, she said, is a notarized contract signed on January 19th, 2005, just over 2 months before Baron Trump was born. She held the first page to the document camera, the image projected on the main screen behind her. Crisp and damning, private agreement, reproductive contingency clause, parties, Donald J. Trump, trust holder, Melania K. Legal alias. There was a moment of collective confusion in the room until she turned the page and highlighted the signature line. It was real. It was inked. It was dated. And it was unmistakable. Donald J. Trump, Melania K. initialed, but signed in full 2 pages later. Gasps rippled. One of Trump's attorneys stood abruptly. Madam Chair, I must strongly object. But before he could finish, the chairwoman raised her gavel and slammed it once, sharp as a gunshot. Overruled. Sit down, counsel. He obeyed, slowly. Jasmine tapped her pen on the table once, then continued, her voice never rising above conversational. Clause 8, subsection C, she said, and I quote, subject agrees to produce male heir. Payment of $5 million and full transfer of designated estate assets shall be granted upon successful delivery. The words hit like glass shattering against marble, not figuratively, literally. A water glass in the gallery cracked as someone squeezed it too hard. A woman in the back gasped aloud. The journalists didn't write. They just stared, mouths slightly open, eyes locked on the screen like it was broadcasting the unraveling of something far older than a presidency. Jasmine kept going. This wasn't a prenuptial. This wasn't even a will. This was a biological transaction. A womb for wealth agreement, engineered with the precision of a property deal. The screen shifted again, this time showing the attached addendum. Contingency terms applied to male offspring only. Female offspring shall not trigger payment or property transfer. No appeal clause provided. Trump flinched, not dramatically but visibly. His mouth twitched. His leg bounced beneath the table, a man trying not to crack under national broadcast. His lawyers looked pale now, lips tight, fingers white-knuckled over pens. Jasmine turned back to the audience, but this time her gaze didn't land on the committee. It went straight into the camera, into the millions of homes where viewers sat on edge, watching their idea of power twist into something grotesque. Tell me, she said, not as a question, but as an indictment. What kind of father assigns a monetary value to his unborn child? What kind of man requires a gender condition before fulfilling a promise to the woman carrying his legacy? No one moved. The flags behind the dais stood stiff as bone. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. And then, quietly, almost gently, she turned to the next page. "There's more," she said. "An attached document titled Asset Transfer Schedule outlines the items to be dispersed following successful mail delivery. Included one Palm Beach property valued at $9.4 million and a securities account to be held in Melania's name upon confirmation of male birth." Another screen lit up, showing the page with cold, transactional language. No warmth, no mention of family, just numbers, deadlines, clauses. Jasmine didn't look up. She didn't need to. The audience could feel it, could taste it. This wasn't just control. It was design. Planned, signed, hidden, and now exposed. She finally met Trump's eyes across the chamber. Not with anger, not even judgment, with something colder. Certainty. And then she said what no one expected. This child wasn't born into a family. He was born into a framework. And just like that, the room shattered. Not with sound, not with screams, but with realization. Trump hadn't secured an heir. He'd purchased one. The silence that followed was colder than any outrage. It wasn't the kind of silence that waits. It was the kind that knows. The kind that seeps into the bones of a country that's just realized something sacred might have been for sale all along. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She simply reached for a slim black remote and pressed a single button. The main screen behind her flickered. The courtroom dimmed by half, as if even the lights knew what was coming next, demanded a different kind of reverence. The timestamp appeared first. January 18th, 2023. Location, federal deposition. Manhattan Office of Oversight Council. Then the man appeared. Grainy, pale, but unmistakable. Michael Cohen, former attorney, former loyalist, former fixer. The room inhaled all at once, and then he began to speak. "Donald always talked about legacy, not family, legacy, not love, optics." His voice was tired, not from age, but from truth that had sat too long in the throat. Back in early 2005, I remember him saying it clear as day. "She'll get what she needs, as long as I get what I want." A son. That's all he cared about. Not raising a child, not being a father, just continuing the name, the look, the brand. He paused on the screen, visibly swallowing, like even remembering it left a metallic aftertaste. He didn't want a baby. He wanted a monument. Gasps didn't come this time. People had already stopped breathing. One member of the committee looked down at their hands, clenched in their lap. A reporter covered her mouth. And across the aisle, Donald Trump sat frozen, a statue painted in red flesh, eyes narrowed into slits, the muscle in his jaw twitching violently beneath skin that suddenly looked too thin. Then he snapped. Trump slammed his fist onto the table. Loud, raw, echoing. The microphones caught the full force of his outburst. "Lies! All of it! He's a convicted felon, a liar, a disgrace!" His voice cracked halfway through, but he powered through the final word like it might redeem something. But no one looked at him. Not the cameras, not the committee, not the country. They were all watching Jasmine Crockett, still standing, still calm, still staring forward as if Trump had become background noise in his own unraveling. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked gently back at the screen as Cohen spoke one final time. "I used to think he just wanted control. Now I think he wanted to be God over something too small to fight back." Jasmine let that sit for a breathless moment, then clicked to pause the video. The screen froze on Cohen's face, worn, weary, and framed in truth. She turned to the room, not with fury, but with sorrow sharpened into clarity. "He didn't build a family," she said, her voice soft and devastating. "He brokered one." And with that, the illusion of fatherhood cracked. Not with paperwork this time, but with a voice once closest to the throne, now pulling back the curtain. And what it revealed wasn't a man, it was a machine. A machine engineered not for nurture, but for legacy. One built not from blood and heart, but from steel contracts and frozen cells. Jasmine stood still, the room simmering in silence. But the screen behind her had already begun to change. Without touching a button, as if summoned by the truth itself, the next file appeared, colder than the last, more clinical, less human. It was a scanned letterhead, Zentrum for Reproductions Medicine, Zurich date, February 10, 2005. Patient, Melania K. treatment, type, IVF, embryo implantation, genetically selected, male. Authorization, Donald J. Trump. A low, involuntary gasp drifted through the chamber like the last breath before a storm. Jasmine took one step forward. This document, she said quietly, was obtained through cooperation with a European whistleblower protection initiative. It confirms that in early 2005, a male-only embryo selection procedure was performed on a patient listed as Melania K. under a private diplomatic classification. Authorization was provided not by the patient, but by Donald J. Trump himself. She let that land, not just on the committee, but on every woman watching across America, on every mother, on every daughter. The kind of revelation that made even the hardwood floors beneath the chamber feel unstable. Then the screen shifted again. A blurred silhouette appeared, black and white, anonymous. The voice that followed had been altered, distorted to protect its source, but no amount of voice masking could dilute the ache in the words. She didn't speak, the nurse said softly. She came in under escort. 2 American men in suits. No names, no warmth, just silence. She signed the consent, but she didn't look at it. Or us. The voice paused, almost like it needed to look away before continuing. We were told this was a diplomatic request, high security, exception granted for psychological burden tied to political future. But I remember reading the clause. It wasn't medical, it was genetic. It requested male only. The words male only echoed twice through the speakers, reverberating like a slow, deliberate heartbeat in a room suddenly devoid of air. Jasmine let the image linger. The silhouette sat still on screen, hands folded tightly, voice trembling beneath the distortion. It was a ghost from a clinic half a world away, but the chill it brought reached every corner of the capital. She turned back to the committee. Switzerland prohibits sex selection under non-medical circumstances. But this procedure was approved, pushed through under a loophole, psychological strain tied to anticipated public role. The child wasn't even conceived yet. But the father, if we still want to call him that, was already branding the future. She clicked again. A page filled with codes and checkboxes appeared. At the top, genetic selection profile, approved for transfer. Underlined 3 times was a single line, Y chromosome priority confirmed. Backup, embryos destroyed post-selection. And that was the quietest moment of all. No gasps, no interruptions, just a sickening stillness. One of the committee members slowly leaned back in their chair and covered their mouth with a shaking hand. Because this wasn't surrogacy, this wasn't fertility, this was curation. A future assembled like a marketing campaign. A child chosen like a product launch. Not just a boy, but the right kind of boy, European mother, American father, political optics, controlled legacy. Not a son, Jasmine said, her voice low, almost reverent in how it carried the weight, but a prince, a brand asset. Trump didn't speak. His jaw was set like concrete, but his eyes darted, back and forth, to the monitors, to his lawyers, to the silent committee around him, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. And still, Jasmine stood unmoved. She didn't gloat, she didn't celebrate, because this wasn't triumph. It was a funeral for the illusion of natural lineage, for the idea that this was ever about love or choice. It wasn't. It was always a blueprint. And in that moment, America understood that this boy, born into cameras, contracts, and a name heavier than his crib, was not just a child. He was engineered legacy, frozen in glass, signed into existence, and designed not to live freely, but to inherit control. Jasmine let that realization simmer in the chamber, letting the echoes of genetic blueprints and destroyed embryos dissolve into a silence so complete it felt suffocating. No one dared to speak. No one reached for water. Even the ambient hum of electronics seemed to dim in reverence to what had just been laid bare. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into a smaller folder now, one wrapped in faded gray linen, the corners soft from time, the seal on its clasp nearly rubbed away. She didn't announce what it was. She didn't have to. The way she held it, carefully like it was something fragile and alive, told the room it wasn't another contract or deposition. This one had a soul. She undid the clasp with 2 fingers, peeled the flap back, and drew out a single sheet of cream-colored paper. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten, inked in looping cursive with uneven pressure, like the hand that wrote it had trembled between lines. She placed it under the document cam, and as the page filled the screen behind her, the courtroom shifted again, not with drama, but with something colder, more intimate, and Jasmine began to read. April 3rd, 2009. There are nights I sit outside his room and just listen to him breathe. He is small and perfect and unknowing. I wonder if he will grow up free, or if he will grow into what they already say he must become. Sometimes I wonder if I birthed a boy or a business plan. She paused, not to catch her breath, but because the room had lost its own. A wave of stillness swept across the chamber, heavier than outrage, deeper than politics. One of the committee members lowered their eyes, the weight of those words visibly pressing down. A journalist in the press row dropped their pen and didn't bother picking it up. Across the country, people watching from their couches, phones, hospitals, lunch breaks, paused. Not because they were told to, but because something unspoken inside them recognized that sentence like a wound they'd never named. Jasmine looked up from the letter and spoke into the silence. This wasn't written by a lawyer. This wasn't crafted by a fixer, a strategist, or a communications team. This was written by a woman, a wife, a mother. She turned her head, not toward Trump, but toward the camera, the nation, and her voice dropped, not into anger, but into sorrow. A woman who gave birth inside a gilded contract. A woman who was promised security in exchange for silence. A woman who looked into her newborn's eyes and saw not a child, but a checklist. The screen behind her remained frozen on the phrase, or a business plan. Jasmine didn't blink. She was asking the question no mother should ever have to ask in secret. She was wondering out loud but alone whether the most powerful man in her home had turned her womb into a ledger and her child into a yield. There was no objection, no rebuttal, not even from Trump. He sat motionless now, arms folded, lips drawn tight, but the fury had faded. Something else had taken its place, something quieter. Recognition. Because that sentence, that one brutal whispered line, had pierced deeper than any document ever could. Jasmine gently folded the letter again, as if the paper itself had been through enough, and slid it back into its envelope. She never mailed it, she added, more to herself than anyone else. She never even signed it. And then she said the line that cracked something in the room far more sacred than policy or politics. She was asking herself what too many women have been forced to ask in silence. If I bring a child into a contract, what happens to his childhood? The chamber didn't move, because now this wasn't about Trump. This wasn't about Melania. This wasn't even about Barron. It was about every woman watching who had ever felt like their value was conditional. About every child raised under expectations that were inked before they were born. And in that stillness, Jasmine Crockett did something no document could. She made the country feel it. Not just the scandal, but the ache, the cost, and the quiet, terrible grief of a mother who no longer saw her child as a boy, but as a product she had been commissioned to deliver. Jasmine let the weight of that truth settle like fog, thick and choking. She didn't need to say another word. For the first time in this hearing, no one was thinking about party lines, talking points, or rebuttals. They were thinking about that line, a business plan, and what kind of prison a woman must live in to write it but never send it. But while the grief was still lingering in the air, Jasmine turned the page again, and the tone shifted, not softer, darker, because what she was about to reveal wasn't about conception. It was about disappearance, the kind that doesn't happen in darkness, but in plain sight. With a tap of her remote, the screen behind her lit up again, this time displaying a clean, white calendar grid, each day neatly labeled, each one's blank. The header read, Office of the First Lady, January 21st to April 30th, 2017. Public schedule, no appearances. Jasmine let the emptiness speak for itself. Row after row of silence. No school visits, no speeches, no interviews, no cause, no press releases, just absence, punctuated by white squares. For the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency, she began, Melania Trump was missing from the public eye. There were no official events, no photographs, no social engagements, no movement at all. She clicked again. Now the screen displayed a detailed floor plan of Mar-a-Lago. Jasmine walked toward the board and pointed to a highlighted section in red, an isolated corridor with 2 entrances, 1 elevator, and a security overlay blinking level 5 restricted access. This is Wing 4, Jasmine said, the private residential suite of the First Lady. Between January 25th and May 2nd, security logs show Melania Trump entered this wing and never exited, not once. Gas rustled through the gallery. On the monitors, a digital overlay displayed the timestamps. Each day, same time. 1 single entry, no recorded exits. Jasmine's voice dropped lower, and with it, the room grew still again. This wasn't maternity leave. This wasn't privacy. This was a sealed chamber. She was not overseas. She was not ill. She was hidden. Trump stirred in his chair now, visibly tense, lips curling slightly, as one of his lawyers leaned in with a whisper. But Jasmine didn't look at them. Her attention was on the new screen rising behind her. It was a visitor log. Name, Vincent G. Marlowe. Profession, estate and custodial attorney. Visit, dates, February 2nd, March 6th, April 12th, April 27th. Location, Mar-a-Lago Wing 4. Private entry. The highlight circled his name 4 times. Vincent Marlowe, Jasmine said, her voice now sharpened with intent, is a high-profile family law attorney, not a government staffer, not a White House advisor. And yet, he visited Melania Trump 4 times in 100 days, always after hours, always unannounced, always alone. The weight of implication fell like iron across the chamber. Each visit occurred behind level 5 access clearance. No aides, no press, no oversight, just a lawyer, and a woman who hadn't been seen in over 3 months. One of the committee members leaned in, clearly unsettled. Madam Crockett, he asked, what was she doing in that room? Jasmine turned back to the podium. The question didn't seem to surprise her. In fact, she had been waiting for it. She was planning an exit. You could almost hear the collective heart of the room pause. According to internal logs and sealed transcripts, she continued, Melania had initiated legal inquiries into asset division, custodial terms, and trust restructuring in secret, all while still officially listed as First Lady of the United States. The screen flipped again. This time it showed a scanned memo. Header, Draft Custodial Contingency, Confidential. Author, Vi Marlowe. Excerpt, if departure is initiated before inaugural quarter ends, subject may forfeit property and custodial rights as structured in Trust or 3B. And below that, in handwriting, slanted, rushed, anxious. 2 words, I can't leave. Jasmine stood still, letting the screen hang like a noose behind her. She didn't vanish because she wanted to, she said. She vanished because leaving meant surrendering not just wealth, but her son. At that, a reporter dropped their notepad. One of Trump's lawyers stood, only to be immediately hushed by the chair. But Jasmine was already looking back into the camera. Not to accuse, not to perform, to mourn. She wasn't missing, Jasmine said. She was negotiating her own captivity. And suddenly the question that had echoed through tabloids and television screens, "Where is Melania?" was replaced by something far more terrifying. What was she trapped behind, and who was holding the key? Jasmine didn't let that moment cool. She took a step forward, not toward Trump, not toward the committee, but toward the ledger of silence itself. What she held next wasn't printed on government letterhead. It wasn't legal evidence in the conventional sense. It was colder, more precise, and infinitely more damning. A new document lit the screen: confidential addendum, marital asset protection amendment, date October 11, 2016, subject election cycle contingency, spousal retention terms. She didn't say anything at first. She let the title hang, the date hover. She let the word retention rattle the spine of everyone watching. Then she spoke. 4 days after the Access Hollywood tape surfaced, this contract was drafted. A low ripple moved through the gallery. Some had forgotten the timing, others had never known. But everyone remembered the tape, the voice, the laugh, the sentence that nearly fractured a campaign. Grab them by the "no need to finish it." Everyone remembered. Trump had faced the fire then. But Jasmine was revealing what he'd used to extinguish it. She continued, "This addendum was designed not to protect Melania, but to contain her. In the event she chose to leave the marriage before the election was over, she would forfeit all scheduled estate transfers. Her custodial position over Barron would be converted to secondary guardian. Her discretionary budget revoked. Her security detail reassigned." The screen filled with excerpted clauses, each more horrifying than the last. Clause 4B, should Subject 1 exit the marital contract prior to 11/09/2016, all entitlements outlined in Trust, Euro 4G, and Schedule C shall be nullified in full. Clause 5A, custody of minor offspring shall default to trust holder 2, pending outcome of post-election arbitration. Clause 6C, Subject 1 must maintain visible presence at minimum 5 public campaign or media events per month during remainder of election cycle. Jasmine paused. Her voice was calm, but inside it was thunder. She wasn't a wife, she was collateral. Trump shifted in his chair, but this wasn't like earlier. There was no outburst, no table pounding. He knew these words, he had signed them. Jasmine took one step closer to the mic. She stayed, not for love, not for dignity, not for belief. She stayed for survival. Then she read aloud the final clause, Clause 7A. In exchange for continued visibility and silence through November 8, 2016, Subject 1 shall be entitled to post-election estate reinstatement, including Geneva property and custodial reevaluation. The words continued visibility and silence appeared in bold on screen. Not metaphorically, literally. Someone in the audience whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough to carry. Jasmine didn't look away. She pointed to the screen again. "That's not a clause," she said. "That's a ransom." Then she turned to face the committee. Her tone dropped to a whisper, the kind that carries farther than a scream. "Insurance is for things you expect to break," she said, "not for people you trust." That line didn't echo in the chamber. It stuck to the walls, to the skin, to the cameras still streaming to millions of households across the country. The kind of sentence that slips into living rooms like a shadow and refuses to leave. She stepped back, folding the document carefully. And across from her, Trump remained silent. Not in strategy, but because deep down, even he knew, you don't insure what you love. You insure what you're willing to lose. And as the screen behind Jasmine dimmed into black, the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, like the final inhale before a truth too big to speak. A truth not about a wife, but about a child. With a soft click, Jasmine advanced the next slide. It wasn't a contract, not a letter, not a memo. It was a ledger. An offshore registry of LLCs filed through shell firms in Delaware, Panama, and the Cayman Islands. Most viewers watching from home wouldn't recognize the acronyms, but everyone understood the pattern. Line after line of corporate names flickered across the screen like a constellation of control. BT Holdings, Trump Youth Legacy LLC, Barron Futures Management, T Initiative Group, Custodial Class B. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She let the names crawl across the screen, like vines wrapping themselves around what used to be a childhood. Then she pointed to one in particular. BT Holdings, she said softly. Registered June 2006. That's 4 months after Barron's birth. She turned her gaze slowly to the room. Let me ask you this. Who builds a limited liability company before their child can walk? Who launches a custodial fund not for education, but for political brand alignment? The room was still, but the chill had returned, this time heavier, more human. Because what Jasmine had just unveiled wasn't a financial structure. It was a childhood, broken down into filings. Click, the screen shifted again. Now it showed a scanned excerpt from an internal strategic memo. Subject, BT Development, 18-year rollout timeline. Date, November 2006. Excerpt, initial investments suggest youth legacy. Brand may surpass primary family narrative by 2030. Recommend accelerated trademarking of name variants. Target, speaking engagement prep at age 12 to 14. A gasp, sharp and immediate, escaped someone in the gallery. Jasmine nodded once, solemnly. This wasn't inheritance, she said. This was a dynasty project. She gestured again into the list. These weren't built to protect a child. They were built to shape one. Before he even knew what the world was. Before he could choose who he wanted to be. She clicked again. The screen now displayed a timeline. Birth, trust creation, LLC filings, domain registrations, brand proposals, trademark applications, BT Trump, the next Trump, Trump Youth Movement, and beneath it all, one photo, a baby wrapped in white, his eyes still closed, a caption underneath read only, Legacy secured. Jasmine stepped closer to the mic. He never stood a chance, she said. He was born with a legacy, not a name, a plan, not a path, a script, not a story. Across the room, Trump didn't interrupt. He didn't even shift. Perhaps for the first time in his life, there were no more words left to weaponize. Because Jasmine hadn't just uncovered contracts, she had uncovered conditioning. Not financial, but psychological. And everyone watching, everyone who had ever raised a child, held a grandchild, remembered their own name being called by a parent who meant it, felt the quiet horror of what had been built here. A boy's life, constructed like a campaign, his name trademarked before he had teeth, his future budgeted before he had a voice. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. We are not witnessing the story of a child, she said. We are witnessing the manufacturing of an heir, and not an heir to love or wisdom or values, but to power. Engineered, predicted, owned. She let the last word settle. Owned. Then with nothing but stillness in her hands, she asked the one question no one in the room could answer. When does legacy stop being protection and start becoming possession? And this time the silence didn't just linger. It accused. Jasmine's eyes didn't blink as she turned toward the screen again, raising the remote in her hand, not like she was about to press play on a video, but like she was releasing something that could never be put back in its box. What came next wasn't paperwork. It wasn't testimony. It wasn't a memo or a contract or a numbered clause. It was a recording, one that was never meant to be seen, and once seen, never forgotten. The screen faded to black, then flickered into a grainy black and white feed, time-stamped March 24th, 2017, 11:06 p.m. The source, an internal surveillance camera from Mar-a-Lago, Wing 4, restricted access, level 5 clearance, where Melania had disappeared for 100 days. The image appeared slowly, almost like it was holding its breath. A long hallway, cold, marble floor, no motion. Then a figure entered from the right. Melania, no makeup, no entourage, no staff, just her. A plain robe, barefoot, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She wasn't walking quickly. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was going, and then she stopped. In front of a door. The camera didn't pan. It didn't need to. The room number was already burned into the logs. Barren suite. Jasmine said nothing. The image spoke louder than any sentence ever could. Melania stood there. Her hand reached out, rested on the knob, but she didn't turn it. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She didn't even lean in to listen. She just stood there. 1 minute, 2. Then slowly her hand dropped to her side. She looked at the door one last time, eyes hollow, expression unreadable, and turned away. The footage ended there. No music, no sound, no fade out. Just the image of a mother separated not by distance, but by design. And when the screen cut to black, the room didn't exhale, because no one remembered how. Jasmine finally spoke. Her voice was the quietest it had been since the hearing began. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. She looked toward the desk where the stack of contracts and trusts and financial trails now sat like a grave of truths. She just stood there, because even a mother's love can't override a lock built from paper, power, and fear. She gestured back to the door on the screen. That wasn't just a room, that was everything she was allowed to look at, but not touch, hear, but not hold, and protect, but never keep. Trump remained frozen, not defiant, not furious, just still, because even he couldn't spin that image. A mother, alone in a hallway, not pushed, not dragged, but kept out by silence. And all she could do was walk away, barefoot, empty-handed, and invisible. Jasmine looked into the camera for a long moment, her hands at her sides, her shoulders still. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't as a congresswoman, it was as a daughter, as a human being, as someone who understood that power can build empires, but it can also build prisons. She wasn't absent, she was on the other side of the door. And sometimes the hardest thing a mother can do is nothing. She stepped back, and this time the silence in the chamber wasn't political. It was grief, because now everyone had seen what legacy really looked like, when all the gold and cameras and titles were stripped away. Just a woman in a door, and the child behind it she could no longer reach. Jasmine didn't move for a long moment after the screen went black. She stood in the center of the room as if time itself had been suspended around her, as if even gravity didn't dare interrupt the weight of what had just been witnessed. The silence in the chamber wasn't just thick, it was sacred, like a confession had passed through the walls and left them trembling. Not a single person reached for their phone. No one whispered. Even Trump, once red-faced and reactive, now looked like a monument caught mid-crumble. His chest rose, but he didn't speak. His eyes flicked toward the table full of evidence, then down, then nowhere. Jasmine finally stepped forward again, slowly, like she was approaching the last step of a long staircase carved from secrets. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look left or right. She simply reached for the final envelope on her desk, a small one, beige, fraying at the corners. It looked like something found tucked away in the back of a drawer, forgotten for years, but its contents were anything but forgettable. She opened it quietly, revealing a handwritten contract. 1 page, folded once, aged with time and pressure. She slid it beneath the document at camera. The handwriting was familiar. Blocky, angular, aggressive, Donald J. Trump. The ink was unmistakable, sharp, heavy, unapologetic. Jasmine spoke the words slowly, clearly, like she was reading the last line of a country's constitution or its epitaph. Control is protection. Silence is survival. It wasn't metaphor, it wasn't exaggeration. It was his handwriting, his creed. Jasmine turned to face the cameras, the nation, the generation watching in real time. Her voice didn't rise. It narrowed like a blade being drawn with unbearable precision. If love can be insured, she asked, what else in that house was for sale? The question didn't need an answer. It was the answer. The air shifted, not just in the room, but across living rooms, across timelines, across memories, across every viewer who had once believed in the storybook image of a powerful couple, a polished heir, a curated legacy. Now they saw the scaffolding underneath, the contracts, the clauses, the cold machinery that had turned people into assets. Jasmine folded the page again with quiet reverence, then placed it face down. Her hands rested on it like she was pressing a final stone onto a sealed tomb. This was never about a marriage, she said. It was never about family. She turned slowly, locking eyes with no one and everyone. This was about leverage, about a woman who was cast as a queen but handed a script, about a child who was born into a campaign before he ever drew his first breath. She walked toward the center of the chamber once more. There was no gavel, no vote, no final declaration, only truth and the wreckage it left behind. She stopped, her hands open at her sides, the weight of the hearing now living in every breath. I came here today not to expose a man, but to show you what happens when power forgets its cost, when legacy is built not on love, but on silence. The cameras leaned in, not literally, spiritually. They captured her not as a lawmaker, not as a prosecutor, not even as a disruptor, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, the country saw itself, a system that had allowed a contract to define love, a culture that had monetized motherhood, a house that sold silence and called it devotion. And Jasmine left them with no verdict. Only one final open-ended truth. This isn't just about him. It never was. This is about what happens when we start measuring love by value and loyalty by how long someone keeps their mouth shut. She stepped back. No music played, no lights dimmed, no one clapped. And yet, something had ended, not loudly, but irrevocably, because sometimes a single whispered truth has more force than 1,000 shouted lies. And when that truth is written in ink, sealed behind doors, and finally read aloud, the myth doesn't break. It disintegrates. In the end, this was never just a story about power or scandal. It was about what we lose when love is measured in leverage, and children are born into contracts instead of care. Legacy should never come at the cost of humanity, because the moment we begin to treat people as investments, we forget the most sacred truth, that a life, any life, is not to be owned, directed, or branded. It is to be loved. If this story made your heartache or your mind pause, don't just scroll. Sit with it, share it. Let it start a conversation at your dinner table, not just in your feed. Like, comment, and send it to someone who still believes silence protects power more than people. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where paper trails meet human truths and where no contract can bury compassion. Hit the bell, because the next chapter won't comfort you. It'll confront you, and maybe, just maybe, help you see the cost of control in a world that calls it love. This story is a fictional dramatization, born from real shadows, real grief, and the voices history tried to mute. Any resemblance to actual people or events is either unintentional or a mirror we all need to face. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't leaked, it's unearthed. This is Harrison Stories.